Good afternoon. I'm Teresa Miguel Stearns, Associate Dean and Director of our fabulous Daniel F. Cracchiolo Law Library. I am re-recording my introduction of Professors David Gantz, Tony Payan, and Andrew Shepard for this very special book talk. And then we will cut over to the actual book talk. So, welcome. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this very special Law Library Faculty Book Talk in co-sponsorship with the Bacon Immigration Law and Policy Program. We are here today to discuss Professor Gantz and Professor Payan's new book, The Future of Trade, A North American Perspective. David Gantz is the Samuel M. Fegtly Professor Emeritus of Law here at the University of Arizona, as well as Director Emeritus of the International Economic Law and Policy Program. He teaches and writes in the areas of international trade and investment law, regional trade agreements, public international law, and international environmental law. He is also a fellow at the Rice University Baker Institute for Public Policy Mexico Center, with a focus on international trade and economics. Over the course of his distinguished career, Professor Gantz was a visiting professor of law at American University and George Washington University Law Schools, a lecturer in law at the University of Pennsylvania, and a visiting assistant professor of law at the University of Costa Rica. Professor Gantz has also taught at Georgetown University, Loyola University, and the University of San Diego Law School, and Universidad Rafael Landívar in Guatemala. Prior to entering the academy, Professor Gantz served in the Office of the Legal Advisor, the U.S. Department of State, and practiced law in Washington, D.C. Professor Gantz is a graduate of Harvard College and Stanford Law School. Professor Gantz is the author or co-author of 7 books and more than 75 law review articles and book chapters. He has served as a consultant for the UNDP, USAID, and the World Bank, and he has served as an arbitrator in multiple proceedings under Chapter 11, 19, and 20 of NAFTA. Professor Tony Payan is the Francoise and Edward Djerejian Fellow for Mexican Studies and Director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He is also a professor of social sciences at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez in Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, Mexico. Between 2001 and 2015, Professor Payan was professor of political science at the University of Texas at El Paso. Professor Payan's research focuses primarily on border studies, particularly the U.S.-Mexico border. His work centers largely on issues of borderlands as areas of habitation, including the various conditions that affect life in liminal spaces. This includes cross-border flows, both illegal and legal, of people and contraband, as well as border governance. He also researches problems affecting the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Professor Payan has singularly or co-authored or edited 11 books and is working on another volume focused on the state of political parties and the future of democracy in Mexico. He has also authored numerous book chapters and journal articles. Professor Payan has served on several boards, including the Camino Real Regional Mobility Authority in El Paso, Texas, and the Plan Estratégico in Juárez, in Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, Mexico. He is a member of the Greater Houston Partnership's Immigration Task Force and the Mexico Energy Task Force. He previously served as president of the Association of Borderlands Studies between 2009 and 2010. Serving as our interlocutor today is Professor Andrew Shepard. Professor Shepard is here at the College of Law. He is a professor of practice here at the University of Arizona and an associate scholar and deputy director for global faculty. He is a 2-time Wildcat, earning both his bachelor's degree and his law degree from the University of Arizona. He graduated cum laude from the College of Law and was editor-in-chief of the Arizona Journal of Environmental Law and Policy, and was the recipient of the college's Munger Prize for Scholars in International and Business Law. From 2018 to 2020, Professor Shepard taught in the undergraduate law program at the University of Arizona's campus in Qingdao, China, and before going to law school, worked as a high school English teacher in Beijing. Andrew currently teaches here in Tucson, and his courses include international trade law, introduction to procedure, and the American public law system. So please join me in welcoming Professors Gantz, Payan, and Shepard to this very special faculty book talk. Now, as our book talk started, Professor Shepard asked the first following question. Why did the editors, Professors Gantz and Payan, choose to divide the book into three sections, the USMCA, trade with China, and the WTO? And so now we will cut over to the live recorded program of our book talk. Thank you.
Many groups, including the center, are thinking about how that might be a positive way of doing things. So, again, there are things the WTO can do that are not controversial, not the major ones, clearly. So we thought putting this together, particularly if we get some people in the government to read it, or at least talk about it and to think about it, could be useful, despite the fact that this is a very controversial time, election year, both in Mexico and the United States.
Do you have any optimism that they will pay attention this year?
Not really. I mean, I go to Capitol Hill very often. I take out research there. I meet with various senators, Congress members, or their staffers. And one of the things that strikes me quite a bit when I visit Capitol Hill, and David and I will be going again in early March to Washington, D.C., is that they know what's going on. Our politicians know exactly what the problems are. They know what the potential solutions, beneficial solutions might be. And then they tell you, yes, but politically, this is not palatable, this is not feasible, this is not doable. So I'm not very optimistic. In fact, I was telling David yesterday as we were discussing our presentations today, or our discussion today, that there seem to be two conversations. There's a public conversation, which is very politicized, lots of political theater, lots of grandstanding, lots of political profiteering. And then there's a private conversation where they know exactly what's going on. This happens on immigration too, because my chapter in the book is more focused on chapter 19 of the USMCA, which was transferred exactly as it was in NAFTA into the USMCA, and that has to do with the TN visa. The 63 professions that can obtain a TN visa that are very easy to do. Canadians use them quite a bit. You get 900 to 1 million Canadians working in the US with a TN visa every single year. They're professionals, but you only get about 35,000 Mexicans working with this TN visa. But it's not capped. It's open. It's a great visa. It's low cost. It's renewable indefinitely every 3 years. I mean, it's really a convenient way of integrating labor markets. And so I decided to write on that aspect, because I think it was a missed opportunity from NAFTA to the USMCA to really look at labor market integration and frame it within this. So there's a lot of skepticism, and they know what to do, but I'm not optimistic. However, despite the fact that the U.S. pulled out of the TPP, and that was another concern when we were looking at these issues, there was a lot of skepticism, maybe even in the United States. But despite that, if you look at what's going on, there may be some areas and some places where trade is getting in trouble, and countries are a little bit more nationalistic and more protectionist. But there's others where it's booming. I mean, if you look at Mexico and the United States, for example, trade nearshoring is really a thing. It's happening, and lots of U.S. factories are coming to Mexico, taking advantage of this particular platform, the USMCA. I think this is why it survived, and I think as the U.S. deploys its geostrategic objectives vis-a-vis China, and of course the chaos that's going on in Ukraine, Russia, and the Middle East, Mexico is beginning to look like a really good platform to integrate, and so that will necessarily take us to greater trade. So there'll be clearly areas of opportunity to do that. Nearshoring, Mexico, Canada will be one of them. Others, I think I'm a little bit more skeptical that anything will come out of Washington in terms of initiatives to expand trade and trade frameworks in the future.
Yes. I think fondly of a period 20 odd years ago when our local congressman, Jim Colby, was material in getting NAFTA through the Congress and was a supporter of freer trade for his entire long congressional career. And I look at some of the contemporary, Lizzie Fletcher, who is the congresswoman from Houston, who is either chair or co-chair of what we used to call the New Democratic Coalition, one of those relatively small number of Democrats in the Congress who is looking at these issues in a more positive light. I mean, if you're from Texas, it's pretty hard to be against NAFTA or the USMCA because Texas has benefited more from it than probably any other state, except perhaps in the produce area, in which case Arizona has probably benefited more. But it's a long slog, and depending on how pessimistic one is or optimistic about the November election here, it is not entirely impossible to envision a situation where Asia is ceded to China, Europe is ceded to Russia. If that happens, USMCA is going to be a lot more important. That's pretty much all that's going to be left economically. Hopefully that won't happen, and hopefully, regardless of who's elected, people will be a little bit more sensitive about some of the economic issues. But if nobody pays any attention to this in the next few months, maybe they will again when they start looking at what's the new administration going to be doing, what initiatives can be taken in the trade area that aren't dead on arrival. So I think there are still some opportunities in here about what some of our authors have discussed.
Let me add one thing to that. And if you look at the Republicans and the Democrats, there really is, I mean, there are obviously nuances, but where do they stand? I mean, think about the fact that President Biden didn't undo a lot of the restrictions on trade and the tariffs on China, and it didn't go back to the TPP. So that means that these particular ideas, policy ideas, cut across both political parties. I don't see the Democratic Party much more willing than the Republicans to push expanding trade or trade agreements and frameworks in the future, and certainly not the Republican Party. I think they're on a much more nationalistic place right now than they used to be back in the 90s when my boss, James Baker, was, or 80s, late 80s, 90s when James Baker was involved. So today in the US, the mood is let's work with what we got. No more agreements, no more expansion. That's it. We're going to have what we're going to have, and that's it.
I want to go back to your discussion of Chapter 19 and the TN visa. So you mentioned you're going to the Hill in a couple of weeks, and that there's not much appetite for trade discussion. But is there a way to link the TN visa and USMCA to the current border crisis?
Yeah. There's a fact, I think, about the United States that is puzzling, and there's some explanations for it, but I think it's intriguing. Number one is, Germany's economy is in some trouble. I think probably recuperable, but it's in some trouble. I think Europe is a little bit slowing down and trying to figure out what's next. I think China is obviously an economy in much greater trouble than we thought. I think there's a lot more nationalism around the world, and I think the U.S. economy is doing quite well. It's actually been quite resilient. If you think about the legislation that was passed in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, throwing trillions of dollars into the U.S. economy, that has fueled the labor market in the United States, many other aspects of the U.S. economy, but it's doing relatively well. We can discuss about budget deficits and where the money's going to be coming from and things like that. There's obviously other side debates, but this is one of them. And I think the result of the U.S. economic dynamism has been that we have anywhere between 6 and 11 million vacancies. The construction industry can't find workers. The agricultural industry can't find workers. The food processing, hospitality, services, manufacturing, you name it. Almost every single industry in the United States is in need of additional workers. Visas can cover some of that. I mean, if you think about how many millions of workers we rely on who are not U.S. citizens, we have about 13 million green card holders in the United States. That's not citizens, that's immigration. And then you think about the 10.5 million undocumented who are also working. So add the green cards to the 10.5 million, that's over 20 million workers who are really immigrants. And then if you add the 1 million TN visa holders, and you add the 400,000 H-1B, and you add the 300,000 H-2A visa holders, and you keep on going visa after visa, we'll rely on a workforce, an immigrant workforce of some 25 million people. That is a huge number. I am convinced that one of the reasons why President Biden has opted for allowing 30,000 of these migrants from the border to come in is essentially to use a backdoor policy to start supplying some of that labor. I mean, I see them in El Paso because I fly to El Paso every other weekend to teach in Juarez, and I see the line for us, the regular travelers, and then there's a line for the immigrants, and they are holding their notice to appear before an immigration judge, their NTA, and they're and I think they're coming into work. And I think it's partly because the U.S. labor market is strained, and I think it will continue. The numbers that came out just this past month again showed that we continue to produce jobs, and we don't have the workers. I think clearly this is a good opportunity. This is a hunger and food supply meeting, and obviously there's some political interest in creating a crisis. I think much of the crisis at the border is real. There's numbers. 3.6 million people have essentially, or encounters have essentially occurred. Some of them in Arizona, many in El Paso, and all around. Most of them get deported anyway or sent back to Mexico. But we need the workers at the same time. However, we're not into problem solving right now. I think we're into problem maintenance, and I think there's a lot of political games going on the border. But I think we need those folks. We need those people. But the system is sclerotic. Our visa system, our immigration system cannot, number one, cannot take more people in, and our asylum process is so rigid that it cannot process more than 30,000 people a month. The solution, I think, in Congress, they know it, they see it, but they don't want to do it. So I think our economy needs those workers. They are the solution to our economic, especially labor market troubles. I think if we just convince Congress to fully understand that and act on it, I'm not optimistic, but it's there.
Do you think that the USMCA as a whole requires strong political buy-in, strong political commitment from all three parties in order to survive?
I don't. If you had asked me that question a year ago, I would have said careful with the USMCA. David and I are beginning a new project on this issue, and it has to do with the review and revision of the USMCA by 2026. It's our new seminar, our new project. Hopefully, it'll come into a book in the next couple of years. But I think it's I think today, given the circumstances, nobody questions the USMCA. Trump may, but I think it's past that. I think today the U.S., given its geostrategic goals, understands that the USMCA is actually quite valuable to our economy in the United States, and having access to a platform, a manufacturing platform of the caliber of Mexico's is important to maintain the U.S. competitiveness. So I don't think the USMCA will get in any trouble anytime soon, because there's nothing else, nowhere else to go to get the U.S. to have not just its core economy within our borders, but also kind of a concentric circular economy with Canada and Mexico. We now understand the advantages. So now that raises a different question, and that is the review and revision is coming no matter what. So we have a couple of choices. We can say it's working, check, don't move it, let it do what it's going to do in the next 16 years till the next revision. Or we can say, how can we improve it? And most people today that we have talked to, and I think David has done that, and I've done that, say, don't touch it. Don't propose any changes to it. Because if you open it, obviously it means renegotiating, it means interest, it means Congress, it means, so that may make it vulnerable. And so most people tell us, don't move it. It's it's made of sticks without any glue between them. So don't touch it. But I think that we ought to propose changes. So we'll see.
Yeah, just to follow up on that one point and a couple of other things. The way the system works, you have a review of 2026, which could result in some amendments. You have annual reviews thereafter for 15 years until somebody tries to pull out, which doesn't sound very logical to me. But I think going back to the original NAFTA negotiations, which were more than 30 years ago, the idea was the U.S. and to some extent Canada, but mostly the U.S. needed a lower labor cost platform in order to be able to compete with Europe, which had Eastern Europe, and with the various countries. China was not nearly as much of a power then as it was now. But today, certainly, they have their regional comprehensive economic partnership, which has greatly increased trade in intermediate goods with the ASEAN countries, for example. So the need for having this opportunity, whether you're making computers or you're making autos or auto parts or electric vehicle parts or anything else, to be able to do the very labor intensive work in Mexico is still essential. And particularly as not just the Trump, but the Biden administration's move toward what many people call a fortress U.S. position, where we have a very good verbal relationship with the EU, but I'm not so sure the economic relationship is. And needless to say, we have a very high friction relationship with China. If you're going to continue that process, and I think if Mr. Biden is reelected, it probably will continue in many respects. And if Mr. Trump is elected, who knows? You will still need USMCA NAFTA. And I think it's also worth keeping in mind that we have USMCA because Trump's U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, convinced Mr. Trump that we needed this, so we should not get rid of NAFTA, which he wanted to do. And he's going to be, I'm sure, very high level in the Trump administration. If there is one, probably Secretary of Commerce, something like that. And this is his baby. He negotiated the thing with the help of a lot of other people. And most significantly, he negotiated changes with the House Ways and Means Committee, the rapid response labor mechanism and a better state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism, which essentially made the agreement possible to be ratified by huge majorities in both the Senate and the House. So I think the Trump administration would have a big interest. That doesn't mean that he won't try to impose 10% duties on everybody and his brother. You just don't know what's going to happen. Will he withdraw from NATO? Who knows? But the economic benefits of having the USMCA are going to be true over the next 4 or 5 years, regardless. And one of the advantages of the USMCA, like NAFTA, is much of it operates on automatic pilot. Almost everything except some agricultural products with Canada are traded duty-free within the region. Obviously, there are problems. Softwood lumber in Canada, tomatoes, and a number of other things with Mexico. A very negative investment climate in Mexico under Lopez Obrador. A number of outstanding disputes between the countries. But when you figure that we're talking about $1.3 trillion worth of trade every year, it would be remarkable if you didn't have a few rough spots. So I think one of the big advantages of NAFTA, and one of the reasons, and now USMCA, one of the reasons it managed to last without major changes for 25 or more years is because, unlike a lot of other free trade areas, it pretty much after 10 years became automatic, despite some areas. And I think USMCA shares that that similarity in the sense that probably 70% or so of NAFTA you find with minor changes in USMCA. There's a lot of other important stuff in there, but that's the core that makes it possible to have that kind of trade every day, every month, every year.
Ambassador Lighthizer's baby will turn 4 in July.
Yes.
So as it leaves its toddler years, how would you evaluate its efficacy in some key updates? So Tony, if you don't mind, I'd love for you to discuss the labor reforms and specifically the rapid response mechanism. And then David, if you wouldn't mind talking about changes made to the auto sector and in dispute settlement.
Yeah, I think this was a great opportunity. The transition between NAFTA and the USMCA would have been a great opportunity to look at that labor chapter. Why? Because I study immigration and I've done it for 25 years. And there is a historical de facto and sometimes the jure integration between the two labor markets. I mean, what what the Mexican labor has contributed to the United States is undeniable. Or for a century, over a century, Mexican laborers have been coming in practically since the border was set here in Arizona and New Mexico and Texas back in the 1800s. It sped up throughout the 20th century. The Bracero program, almost 5 million Mexicans participated in the Bracero program. When the Bracero program ended, then people continued to come without documents. And today, I think clearly half of the undocumented workers in the United States, of those 10.7 million, are Mexican citizens. And then there is a robust immigration from Mexico now, professionals, investors, and all kinds of things like that. You have a great experience in Tucson, as we do in El Paso and Juarez, with immigration. So clearly, there has been labor integration between the two countries. I think the NAFTA agreement at that time made sense. I mean, it was a kind of a timid way of beginning to look at specific compatibility between the two labor markets, ignoring to a large extent all the other integration on agriculture and all the other stuff that was going on underneath. They focused on professionals. If you look at the agreement, NAFTA/USMCA, because that's exactly what it says, it was transferred over intact. There are 63 professions that are listed as qualifying for a TN visa or a trade visa, or trade North America visa, TN visa. Those 63 professions were created back in, as Debbie said, over 30 years ago. Somebody drew up a list, and then they negotiated it, and they probably took some off, put some in. Zoologists, engineers, economists, and a number of things, right? So to me, it's not reflective of where the labor markets are. It wasn't even reflective of where the labor markets were then, much less now. So to me, it's important to think about that list again, not necessarily the terms. I wouldn't like to see any more restrictions on the TN visa. I think it works perfectly fine. By the way, it's not unique. I think the U.S. has a free trade agreement with New Zealand and Australia that has very much the same visa.
Australia.
Yeah, with Australia, right? Australia. There's that part of the trade I don't study, but yeah, there's a similar with Australia, and it has the same terms. I like that. I think the terms are fine, but the professions are too restrictive. 30 years ago, it was a very different list. Today, what we are proposing is to expand the list to include all kinds of other professions and even technical jobs and things like that, to allow the U.S. to tap into the Mexican labor availability. And of course, Mexico also is going through a demographic transition, but it's much further behind than the U.S., so there's still an opportunity to do that. Or better yet, to go to a negative list, meaning list the professions that do not qualify, cops, intelligence agents, federal government employees, things like that, right? And then let the market decide for itself how to acquire workers and send workers back and forth and employ them and get them into the market. So to us, one of the essential revisions that I would like to propose for 2026 is essentially a negative list. There's a lot of resistance in people that are experts on trade, lawyers. I'm a political scientist, not a lawyer, but there's for the reasons I said, they don't want to touch it. But I think it's a good opportunity to regulate and order the labor markets in North America and go to a negative list and let the market do what the market does. Let employers and workers find each other. They do already. Look, the agricultural visa, the H-2A visa, the H-2A? Yeah, the H-2A visa, I think it's technically capped at about 180,000, but the president has the ability to raise that cap if the agricultural sector needs them. I think last year, there were slightly over 300,000 visas that were issued. That means we need them anyway. So why not include those jobs as part of the NAFTA into Chapter 19? Move all those workers that are coming in anyway at all kinds of visas into a TN system and allow the the market to take care of it. I think that would be the ideal. As for the issue of, I think it was that other aspect that had to do with the U.S. ability to have a labor attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City and look at the conditions of laborers and workers in Mexico was designed, I think, and David may be able to say more about this, because but I think it was designed essentially because I think Trump believed that Mexico was cheating, wages were too low, and that was affecting. And I think he was very focused on the auto industry. So he was very concerned about Mexico cheating its own workers and placing American workers in the auto sector, others too, but the auto sector certainly was central at a disadvantage due to lower wages. And so they decided to push for higher wages, I think 16 an hour for auto workers in Mexico, which is much more than a regular worker would actually make in different manufacturing processes in Mexico. And I think then the labor attaché would verify the working conditions and the wages and things like that. So it gave the U.S. a longer arm of the law, so to speak, to sort of inspect certain plants in Mexico. It's working well. I think there's been only a few cases. I discussed, I think, a couple of them in the chapter, but it's working. I think it's given the U.S. a little bit of a power. The reasons may be the wrong reasons, but at the end of the day, the mechanism, I think it's working. And these workers in Mexico are making a little bit more money. Maybe we pay higher prices for those vehicles because they have to pay higher wages in Mexico. But it seems that it hasn't affected the manufacturing industry, the auto industry a whole lot. These cars are still coming from Mexico. It's still advantageous to building in Mexico. I think David has mentioned not the very large Texas trucks, or Arizona trucks, but the smaller and mid-sized vehicles. So that's working. I think that is something that should stay, especially because I think in Mexico, I am convinced that over time, workers have been cheated out of their fair share. If you look at the acquisition, the purchasing power of workers in Mexico, minimum wage in 1982, 40 years ago, today it's 80% less than it used to be. So clearly Mexico has been, I think Trump was right, kind of cheating its workers from wages and taking advantage. I think, that is a mechanism that will be used. Yeah.
David, would you like to discuss labor, the automobile sector?
I'll say a few things about labor, and then all of those. First of all, the idea of the attachés and the idea of the rapid response arbitration mechanism, which, as Tony points out, has basically been a success with about a dozen cases, came out of the Ways and Means Committee. It was not a Trump idea, but as in the other labor and auto areas, the views of the Democrats and the Republicans are pretty much the same. You raise wages from 40% or 45% of the vehicle, say minimum wages have to be 16%. That means more of these autos and auto parts are going to be produced in the US or Canada and less in Mexico. If you raise Mexican wages, which hopefully over time this mechanism will do, it makes Mexico, maybe instead of 5-to-1 wages, maybe it's only 4-to-1 wages. It makes Mexico a little bit more less competitive with American workers, particularly American union auto workers. So again, I don't think there was a lot of space between Trump and Lighthizer and the House Ways and Means Committee on these issues, because for different reasons, they like the idea of creating more jobs, maybe not union jobs if you're Trump, but more jobs and more production, industrial production in the US, whether it's autos or auto parts or anything else. I think the auto industry is still trying to figure out how this is going to affect things. Needless to say, a lot of parts that were made in Mexico in the past are not being made there anymore because of the $16 an hour rule. There's a higher North American content. It went up to 75% for 62.5%, which I think helps Mexico a little bit as well. So I think it's really hard to know. One of the things to keep in mind about autos, not small trucks, but autos and SUVs, is the normal duty without NAFTA is 2.5%. So you can make small cars in Mexico without meeting all these requirements and probably still sell them in the US, paying the duty for less than it would have cost you to increase the cost by more production. So, and we don't know how much of this is going on, but anecdotal evidence indicates that it's significant. Maybe this is something that the US and Canada will want to look at in 2026, and maybe they'll just want to leave things alone, particularly because nobody's quite figured out how all this is, the impact of electric vehicles, batteries is going to affect the auto industry overall.
What about the dispute settlement? How has
the dispute settlement? There are three pieces of dispute settlement. There's one dispute settlement mechanism, which is designed to review unfair trade cases, anti-dumping and subsidies cases. They didn't touch that at all, which was idiotic. But for a variety of reasons, there was time pressure on the Trump administration because they needed to get the agreement done, at least with Mexico, before the Lopez Obrador regime took over on December 1. Peña Nieto was all in favor of this whole thing. Nobody was quite sure what Lopez Obrador was going to do. So getting the agreement done with Mexico in September was a major objective. And one of the things that slipped by the wayside was this particular review of dumping and subsidies cases. The state-to-state dispute mechanism has been broadened. And again, thanks to the Ways and Means Committee, the mechanism under NAFTA, which was very easy for the US to avoid simply by refusing to appoint panelists, got changed. You can't really effectively do that. If you refuse to appoint panelists, they are appointed from the panelists that the other two countries have appointed. So wonder of wonders, by July 1, all three countries had appointed their panelists. Surprise, surprise. So that took care of it. It very substantially weakened the third pier, which was protection of foreign investment in Mexico. You still have some sectors that have NAFTA-type protection, oil and gas, electricity, infrastructure, communications, and a few others. But most others, you have to exhaust local remedies. You can't bring fair and equitable treatment charges. You can't bring indirect expropriation charges, which is a significant weakening of the mechanisms. The Democrats, many of them, people like Sanders and Warren and public citizen Lori Wallach, have been screaming for this for years. So needless to say, they didn't oppose it when the agreement was negotiated by Mr. Lighthizer, who believes that protecting foreign investment abroad increases American companies to move their businesses abroad, which may or may not be the case. So I think if you look at one of them, there's no change, unfortunately. One of the state-to-state major improvements, in my view, at least, the investor state mechanism, less useful than it was before.
I want to pivot to a topic that's a bit easier, China. That in the book you discuss, or your contributors discuss, A, China's role in the WTO, and B, China-US relations, and specifically the US-CTA, the US-China Economics and Trade Agreement from January 2020. Where do you see both of these at now, and how optimistic are you for some meaningful change in the relations between the US and China and China and the WTO?
I'll let David take that first.
The phase one trade agreement expired almost a year and a half, 2 years ago. This was the one that imposed up to 25% penalty duties on about $350 billion worth of Chinese goods every year. Neither China nor the Biden administration, I think very logically, have seen any reason in trying to go to a phase two agreement, because the only way you could do that would be to get China to back off on its mammoth government subsidies in so many sectors, the so-called China 2025, automobiles, auto batteries, computers, many other things, artificial intelligence, many other things. So basically, both governments have silently said, we'll just keep doing what we're doing. We'll impose the duties on China, and China will retaliate wherever they want to. It obviously affects exports to China, including agricultural exports. But my guess, I think it's a pretty safe guess, I don't know who's going to be president over the next 4 or 5 years, but nothing's going to change unless China changes its policy, which seems to me out of the question. What was the other half?
China and the WTO.
China and the WTA. There are basically, in my view, about 5 problem countries in the WTO: India, China, South Africa, Brazil, and the United States. And they all, in one way or another, are blocking major progress in many areas. We can scream, as we do, about India as much as we want, and they're probably the worst of the group, but there's a competition there. China is a country which talks a really good game when it comes to the WTO and to great power responsibilities in the world, but it doesn't do very much. For example, they're doing nothing, essentially, to deal with the attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and near the Panama Canal, even though many of their ships and many of their products, including petroleum going back and forth, are substantially affected. So they talk a good game. At the moment, the U.S. is talking a good game too. I think we'll see, if anybody follows this ministerial meeting that's coming up in a couple of weeks. The U.S. is still blocking the dispute settlement mechanism with some rationale. I think some good rationale, some real problems with that mechanism that make it basically allow a court mechanism to substitute for negotiations. And the U.S. doesn't like this. They've disliked this since the second Bush administration. So it was nothing new. And the first blocking of an appellate body appointee was by the Obama administration. So you can't blame it entirely on Mr. Trump, and you certainly can't blame it entirely on Mr. Bush. It's a U.S. policy, which, in my view, is not going to change in the next 5 or 10 years. I hope I am wrong, but I think that probably is the situation. The WTO is still functioning in some ways. It does some reports. It's got a very good professional staff, but it's like most other international organizations. It does what the members want it to do. And the big problem with the WTO is you need consensus to do anything, and getting consensus that includes, on the one hand, China and Brazil and India, and on the other hand, the US and the EU, is almost impossible to achieve.
Yeah, you would expect the WTO to lead to some extent and to try to do the diplomatic, not just the technical work that David spoke about, but to do the diplomatic and political work that, to lead and to make to bring forward actual proposals to advance international trade. But I think at this point, they're probably an organization that's somewhat paralyzed by all these other geopolitics going on. And I don't expect any real serious things to come out of the WTO. I think the WTO will survive. It'll be there, but it will be a long time before it can actually begin to say, hey, I can bring something forward, because again, it's the members who actually can trigger those more substantial conversations. If we don't fall back on more protectionist instincts that are kind of floating around in the air, I think the WTO will survive, will be there, and maybe in the future we'll get more active and lead. But right now, I think it's paralysis.
I have a question that I think might be a bit unfair and impossible, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Your book is entitled The Future of Trade. What are you most optimistic about in the future of trade in North America?
First of all, at least for the US and in Western Europe, and even a good part of China and Asia, a lot of it is dependent by the private sector. Good people are selling and buying goods. They're providing services, from relatively small businesses to the giants in the goods and the services areas, and the governments of these major countries are going to have to do a lot more to make it difficult to trade before you cut all of that off. I mean, the U.S. still benefits enormously from exports, even though it's harder to export to China because of the problems. We still benefit from imports. We're trying to detach to some extent, de-link U.S. and China. So you have lots of companies moving to Mexico instead of from China. Well, guess where they're getting their parts and materials? It's not from Mexico, and it's not from the U.S. It's coming from Asia, particularly from China. So indirect linkages, I don't think, are a lot less strong in most areas than they were 2 or 3 years ago. obviously in semiconductors and electric vehicles, batteries, the subsidies and other U.S. policies are changing things. But if you look at the wide range of goods and commodities from, oil and grain and mechanical and electrical products and e-commerce, all of that stuff, maybe it's more the same than it is different. Now, maybe it'll change in a Trump administration. If he puts a 50% tariff on China, that'll cut off most trade entirely, but it won't cut off parts and components going to Mexico or Vietnam and being produced and put in the United States. So it's a lot harder to stop globalization or to slow trade substantially than it meets the eye, because governments can't really do it by themselves.
I guess where I would see the optimism in this is, and I coincide with David on that. Despite the tariffs on China and despite the feelings of protectionism that are mercantilism that are kind of floating in the air, there really hasn't been a whole lot of backsliding. I mean, there's what was there over the last 25, 30 years, it's still pretty much there. What I think these delinking or decoupling or whatever you want to call it, this whole debate about China is going to do is that it's going to activate other potential partners like Vietnam, Brazil, and Cambodia, and a few other countries that might actually be the recipients, and even Mexico, by the way, too, may be the recipients of trade rerouting. And companies will do that. The governments won't do that. I think companies will find it. If they can't bring in from China, if they can't place that in China, they'll see if Mexico works. If it doesn't work, they go to Vietnam. It takes a very long time for these supply chains. But I think the optimism is really hidden in the numbers. If you go back to the U.S.-Mexico trade and you look at the nearly $800 billion in trade that is happening now between Mexico and the United States, Mexico now being number one above China and above Canada, you realize that half of that trade, $375 to $400 billion, is intra-firm. And that, to me, speaks to the incredible depth of the integration of the supply chains and manufacturing chains, integrated production processes. A single product part can go into Mexico and then gets integrated into a larger component and then gets back into the United States, gets reworked, gets back into Mexico, gets reworked. Some people say that as many as 7 times in some processes. Could be 2, could be 3, could be depending on the product or the good. But the reality is that a lot of the firms are simply integrating their processes. They know what they can do in the United States, given tax incentives, given technical capability, given ease of processes, and they know what they can do in Mexico. They integrate the two, and then they trade their own intra-firm goods back and forth. I think a lot of that, and David may know the number, a lot of that is global trade. And really decoupling or delinking those production chains will be a lot more difficult for governments to undo. And even if they try in certain spaces, other countries will come in and fill in the vacuum. And so even though it looks rough in the rhetoric and the politics of it, I think at the end of the day, globalization is really unstoppable, and we're gonna be there.
We are coming up at a hard stop. I just want to thank you so much for a wonderful book. And if there's any partnership that is not at risk of decoupling, I hope it is yours. So thank you very much for a wonderful contribution.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.